Blood was already on the floor before anyone figured out where it was coming from. 3 doctors stood over a dying man and couldn't find the source. The monitors were screaming, the trauma team was shouting over each other, and the only person in that room who knew exactly what was killing him was the night shift nurse nobody had ever bothered to learn the name of. She tried to speak. They told her to step back. She stepped forward anyway. What happened next didn't just save one man's life. It started unraveling a lie that had been running inside Vantage General Hospital for years, and it put a target on the back of the one person who least deserved it. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe right now, because the stories on this channel don't pull punches and they don't slow down. Like this video if you want more, and drop a comment with your city and country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning. Vantage General Hospital sat at the edge of Crestfall, Nevada. Not a glamorous city, not a struggling one, just the kind of mid-sized place where a hospital became the center of everything because there wasn't much else. 18 floors, 2 trauma bays, a reputation built on administration's press releases, and a nursing staff running on 4 hours of sleep and expired vending machine coffee. Nora Callahan had worked night shift in the ER for 3 years. 32 years old, dark circles that concealed nothing. A ponytail she'd fixed so many times throughout a single shift that the elastic was permanently stretched. She moved through the department with the kind of quiet efficiency that people either respected immediately or never noticed at all. At Vantage General, the second option had been the rule since the day she was hired. Her official title was staff nurse, ER. Unofficially, she was the person who restocked supplies the charge nurse forgot to order, who talked down the drunk and belligerent patients before security had to get involved, who stayed 40 minutes past the end of her shift without recording overtime because she'd learned that recording overtime generated paperwork, and paperwork generated conversations with Diane Rusk, and conversations with Diane Rusk never ended without someone feeling smaller than when they'd walked in. Diane Rusk, charge nurse. 12 years at Vantage General. Hair always perfect, clipboard always present, voice calibrated to stay just below the level where HR would have to get involved. She ran the night shift ER the way certain people run things, not with competence, but with the confidence that nobody above her was watching closely enough to catch the difference. She did not like Nora Callahan. She had never said so directly. She didn't have to. It showed up in scheduling. Nora's name appeared consistently on the worst rotations, the short-staffed nights, the holiday doubles. It showed up in the incident log, where Nora had 3 write-ups in her file over 18 months, each one worded carefully enough to sound reasonable and vague enough to mean almost anything. It showed up in the way Diane would walk past Nora during handoff without making eye contact, the way she'd redirect physicians to other nurses mid-conversation, the way she once told a new hire, loud enough for Nora to hear from 2 beds away. Some people here have been here too long and think that means something. Nora had written none of it down. She probably should have. The attending physician on that particular Tuesday night was Dr. Marcus Fowler, 44, broad-shouldered, a trauma background from a level 1 center in Phoenix that he mentioned often enough that his residents had started keeping a silent count. He was skilled. He was also the kind of skilled that shades into arrogance so gradually that the person never notices the transition. He had a habit of interrupting mid-sentence. He had a worse habit of being right often enough that nobody called him on it. "Bennett Bay's yours tonight," Diane said to Nora at the start of shift, dropping a tablet on the nursing station counter. "Boards are full. Fowler's got 2 criticals already. Don't slow him down." Nora picked up the tablet. "Is it Callahan Bay or Bennett Bay? Because I'm—" "Nora," Diane's voice was flat. "It was a figure of speech. Keep up." It was not a figure of speech. Diane used other nurses' names for bays when she wanted them to feel temporary. The shift moved the way. Busy nights moved. In short bursts of controlled chaos separated by 15-minute stretches where everything felt almost manageable. Nora assessed a 60-year-old with chest pain, flagged an abnormal EKG, got the cardiology consult moving before Fowler had finished ordering labs. She triaged a woman with a dislocated shoulder, reduced medication anxiety in a teenager who'd come in alone after a panic attack, and spent 22 minutes tracking down a blood type result that the lab had routed to the wrong patient file. Nobody said thank you. That wasn't unusual. She'd stopped expecting it by month 4. At 11:47 p.m., the ambulance bay doors blew open and a gurney came through moving fast. The paramedic's voice cut above everything else. Construction accident, rebar through the left thigh, transected the tissue, active arterial bleed. We packed it at the scene, pressures dropping, 84/50, and falling. Fowler was already moving. Trauma 1, get me a type and cross. 2 large bore IVs, push saline wide open. Where are we on blood bank? Already called, one of the residents said. The patient's name, by the wristband they'd put on him at the scene, was Dennis Varick. He was 47. He had a construction helmet still half fastened to his head, and a look in his eyes that Nora recognized, the specific look of someone who had just processed, on some level below language, that they might actually be dying. Mr. Varick. She was at his side before he reached the trauma bay. We have you. You're inside. We've got you. He grabbed her wrist, couldn't form words. You can squeeze as hard as you need to, she said. Diane materialized at her shoulder. Callahan, step back and let the team work. I'm the assigned nurse. Fowler's team is set. You're not needed in here. Nora stepped back. She did not leave. She positioned herself at the edge of the trauma bay where she could see the monitors, the wound, the pressure dressings the paramedics had applied, and the way Fowler's team was orienting to the injury site. The rebar wound on the left thigh was significant. Deep, still seeping despite the packing. The residents were focused there. Fowler was directing pressure, calling for imaging, moving with the decisive energy of a physician who knew traumatic extremity injuries cold. The blood pressure read 79/46. Nora watched the number, watched the wound, watched the rate at which the packing was saturating. Then she looked at the patient's abdomen. Dennis Varick's abdomen was rigid, not tensed, rigid. The involuntary, board-hard rigidity of someone bleeding where you couldn't see it. His left flank showed the faintest discoloration at the skin's surface, something easy to miss in the overhead fluorescent lighting at that angle, something that looked like the beginning of a bruise but was spreading in real time. Retroperitoneal hemorrhage. The abdomen was filling with blood, and the thigh wound, significant as it was not the primary source of his crash. She said it once, from the edge of the bay. Dr. Fowler. His abdomen. We've got the wound site, nurse. The thigh is bleeding, but his pressure shouldn't be this low from that alone. His belly is rigid, left flank discoloration. He may have... I am aware of fast protocol, Fowler said, not turning around. When I need a second opinion, I'll ask for one. Diane's hand landed briefly on Nora's arm. Not a touch, exactly. A warning. The blood pressure, 71/41. The monitor's tone shifted. Not an alarm yet, the beginning of one. Nora walked in. She did not wait for permission. She moved to the opposite side of the gurney, pulled on a glove, and pressed 2 fingers carefully along the patient's left flank, palpating the quadrant below the rib cage. The rigidity was unmistakable at contact. Get off my patient, Fowler said. He's losing pressure from somewhere internal, she said. Left flank. I need someone to run a fast on the abdomen right now. If this is retroperitoneal, the thigh wound is a secondary concern, and he's bleeding out in front of us. The room went quiet. Not silent. The monitors kept talking. The IV pumps kept running. But the human noise in that room dropped completely. Fowler stared at her. His jaw was tight, and there was something behind his eyes that might have been irritation and might have been the first flicker of doubt. Get the ultrasound, he said. It wasn't directed at anyone in particular. The resident with the probe was already moving before Fowler finished the sentence. The image came up in 11 seconds. Free fluid, left upper quadrant, significant collection, spilling into the retroperitoneal space. The kind of bleed that killed people quietly while a team managed the obvious wound. Fowler's voice changed. Get IR on the phone now. We need vascular surgery. Who's on call? The room reorganized itself around the new information. Dennis Varick went to the OR 17 minutes later with a blood pressure that was climbing instead of falling because someone had caught the right bleed in time. He survived the surgery. He survived the night. He survived. Nora stood in the trauma bay afterward, her gloves off, her hands steady, and watched the team disperse the way teams did after an emergency resolved. Quickly, without ceremony, already moving toward the next thing. Fowler passed her without speaking. One of the residents, a third-year named Tripp, who'd been in the room, stopped beside her for exactly 2 seconds. Good catch, he said, quiet enough that no one else heard. And then he was gone. Diane was waiting for her at the nursing station. My office. She said it without inflection, the way you'd say any two words that didn't mean anything on their own. The office was a windowed room off the main hallway, small enough that two people standing in it felt like a choice. Diane closed the door. She set her clipboard on the desk. She sat down and did not invite Nora to sit. You walked into an active trauma resuscitation after being asked to step back. The patient needed, I'm not discussing the patient, I'm discussing your behavior. Diane's voice was even, almost gentle. That was the thing about Diane. She never raised her voice. Didn't need to. You disregarded a direct instruction from the attending and from me. That is insubordination, Nora. That goes in your file. He would have died. That is not for you to decide. Nora looked at her. He had a retroperitoneal hemorrhage. His pressure was in the 70s. If we'd managed only the thigh wound, I understand what happened. I am telling you that your conduct was unacceptable, and I will be documenting it formally. You'll receive a copy within 24 hours. She paused. This is the fourth time in 18 months. The other three were also documented, formally. Diane picked up her clipboard. You may return to your patients. Nora went back to work. She had 8 patients. She assessed every one of them within the next hour. She found a medication error in the chart of a 63-year-old man that would have delivered the wrong dose of anticoagulant. She caught it, corrected it, notified the pharmacy, and did not write herself up for the catch because that was not how the paperwork worked. By 3 a.m., the department had quieted the way hospital ERs quieted between 2 and 4, not empty, never empty, but in a kind of suspended motion. Nora was charting. Her feet hurt. She had a bruise forming on her right knee from where she'd hit the corner of a drawer in the trauma bay earlier and hadn't had time to register it until now. She heard the front doors. Not the ambulance bay, the main entrance, the walk-in doors. She looked up because the sound was wrong. The middle of the night brought certain kinds of people through those doors. What came through now sounded like something else. Multiple people, moving in a way that was deliberate without being rushed. The particular cadence of people who had covered a lot of ground to get somewhere and were finally there. 4 men. Civilian clothes, jeans, plain jackets, but nothing about them read civilian. The posture was too consistent. The way they moved through the space without looking at anything unnecessary, eyes going to the nursing station first because that was the logical center of the room. It was trained, all of it. The one in front was maybe 38, dark hair cut short, a jaw that hadn't been shaved in 3 days, a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He moved to the counter and waited for Nora to look up, and when she did, he said 3 words in a voice that was even and unhurried. We're looking for Nora Callahan. The department went quiet the way it had in the trauma bay, the same held breath quality. Nora set down her pen. I'm Nora Callahan. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out something small, set it on the counter between them. A unit patch, worn at the edges. Colors faded from whatever conditions had faded them. She recognized the insignia not from a textbook, not from a news article. She recognized it because she had once worn one exactly like it. Her hand moved toward it before she'd decided to move. We've been looking for you for 14 months, the man said. My name is Captain Reed Harlan. These are Sergeant Yates, Corporal Dix, and Warrant Officer Bale. He paused. You saved our lives. We needed you to know that. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the department, a monitor beeped twice and then settled. Nora looked at the patch on the counter. She had not touched it yet. She wasn't sure she was ready to. Because the last time she had seen that insignia, she had been kneeling in the dirt with her hands covered in blood that was not hers, and she had been certain as she had ever been of anything, that she had failed. Her fingers closed around the patch. The fabric was stiff in some places, soft in others, worn down to near transparency along the edges where a sleeve had rubbed against it for months or years. She turned it over in her palm. The back was blank. No names, no unit number, nothing that would mean anything to someone who didn't already know. She knew. Sit down, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. All of you. Captain Reed Harlan looked at the chairs along the wall. The plastic ones bolted to a metal frame, the kind designed to be cleaned with a hose, and sat without comment. The other 3 followed. Yates was the biggest, built like someone had assembled him with durability in mind. Dix was younger than the rest, mid-20s maybe, with the kind of stillness that either meant calm or meant someone had trained the fidgeting out of him. Bale had a prosthetic left hand. She noticed it the way she noticed all medical details, automatically, without staring. Nora came around the counter. She did not sit. She stood in front of them with her arms crossed, not in a defensive way, more like she was holding herself in place. "How did you find me?" "VA records, eventually." Harlan rested his forearms on his knees. "You changed states twice. You're not listed anywhere public. It took a while." 14 months, you said. 13 of those were dead ends. He said it without drama. We weren't going to stop. She looked at him. She looked at all of them. Yates had a scar along his collarbone that disappeared into his shirt collar. She knew, without being told, approximately how it had gotten there. Dix was watching her the way someone watched a person they'd heard described many times, and were now measuring against the description. Bale's right hand was resting on his knee, and his left, the prosthetic, was at his side. Still, in a way real hands rarely were. "I need to know something first," Nora said. Harlan nodded once. Specialist Renner. She said the name carefully, like it was something that could break if she wasn't careful with it. "Did he? Was there anything that could have been done differently? Anything at all? I've gone over it." She stopped, started again. "I've gone over it a lot." The waiting room was quiet. Through the glass doors of the main entrance, the parking lot was empty except for a truck she assumed was theirs. The department behind her was running on the low hum of a slow night. Nobody came out to check on her. Nobody was paying attention. For once, that was fine. Harlan looked at her for a moment before he answered, and she appreciated that he didn't rush it. "Renner had a penetrating chest wound that damaged the right ventricle," he said. The field surgeon who reviewed the casualty report afterward estimated he had a survivable window of roughly 4 minutes from point of injury if he'd been in a level 1 trauma center. He was not. You had a combat kit, a dirt road, and approximately 90 seconds before his pressure went non-existent. He paused. "You did not fail Renner. Renner died because of where we were and what hit him. That's the complete truth." Nora's jaw moved. She didn't say anything for a moment. "I did a thoracotomy." "I know. In the field, with inadequate light and no suction. I know what you did. We were all there." Harlan's voice didn't waver. "You kept the rest of us alive for 6 hours until extraction. 6 hours across 2 positions, with 3 of us non-ambulatory. Yates had a femur fracture." He glanced at Yates briefly. "He'll tell you himself that you physically dragged him 40 meters to the second position when the first one became untenable." Yates said, 43 meters. I counted later. It was a small thing, stupid almost, but the specificity of it, 43 meters counted after the fact, remembered, did something to the air in the room that Nora wasn't prepared for. She put her hand over her mouth for a second, just a second. Then she dropped it. "Why now?" she asked. "Why come here?" "We tried earlier, couldn't find. When we finally did..." Harlan reached into the same jacket pocket. This time he produced an envelope. "We also found out about this." She took it. Inside was a printed copy of a formal complaint. She recognized the format. Hospital incident documentation, Vantage General header, her name in the subject line. Disciplinary action, insubordination, repeated pattern of conduct. Diane Rusk's name at the bottom, countersigned by someone from administration she'd never spoken to directly. "Where did you get this?" Her voice was flat now. "We have a contact at a veterans advocacy organization. They monitor employment situations for former service members in civilian healthcare. Someone flagged your file to them 6 weeks ago. We don't know who. Could have been a coworker, could have been a patient. The flag came through and it got to us." Harlan watched her read. 3 write-ups in 18 months, every single one filed after you intervened on a patient outcome. She set the envelope on the counter. The thing about reading your own disciplinary file in front of people who came looking for you specifically was that it produced a very particular kind of anger. Not the hot kind, the kind that made you say things. The cold kind, the kind that settled and stayed. "I need to finish my shift," she said. "Of course." Harlan stood. The others stood with him. "We're not here to pull you out of anything. We just..." He seemed to look for the right word and not quite find the standard one. "We needed you to know what you did, what it meant. We needed you to hear that from us." Nora looked at the patch in her hand. She'd been holding it this entire conversation without realizing she hadn't put it down. "Where are you staying?" "There's a motel on Route 9. We drove through from Fort Calder. That's 4 hours." "3.5, Dick said. His first words of the entire conversation. "Harlan drives like he's in convoy." Harlan gave him a look that contained roughly 7 years of shared experience. Nora almost smiled. Almost. "Come back tomorrow morning, after 7. I have questions. About that night, about what the review said." She paused. "About Renner's family. Whether anyone told them." "His parents were notified through official channels. His mother—" Harlan stopped. "That's a longer conversation." "I know. That's why I said come back." They left the way they'd arrived. Quiet, deliberate, not making anything larger than it needed to be. She watched the truck pull out of the lot and then stood at the main entrance doors for a moment, with the cold Nevada air coming through the gap before she turned and walked back into the department. Diane was at the nursing station. She had not been there 60 seconds ago. Nora had no way of knowing whether she'd been watching the entire exchange or had arrived at the end of it, and the specific calibration of Diane's expression, neutral in the way a drawn curtain was neutral, gave nothing away. "Who were they?" Diane asked. "Old friends," Nora said. She picked up a chart. She went back to work. The rest of the shift passed without major incident, which in a busy ER meant 3 more acute assessments, a minor procedure she assisted on, and a domestic situation in the waiting room that security handled before it became a nursing problem. By 6:45 a.m. The day team was filtering in, and Nora gave handoff with the efficiency of someone who had done it hundreds of times and knew exactly which details mattered and which ones could be summarized in a sentence. She did not mention Dennis Varick. The day team would see his chart. The chart said what it said. She changed in the locker room and came out into the early morning light outside the staff entrance, squinting the way you squinted when you'd been in fluorescent light for hours, and the sun felt like a personal offense. She sat on the low concrete wall by the parking lot and drank the rest of a coffee that had gone cold somewhere around 4 a.m. and thought about Renner. Not the way she usually thought about him. The looping kind. The kind that ran the sequence again and looking for the divergence point. But differently. Quieter. He was already gone. Harlan hadn't actually said those words last night, but she'd heard them anyway. In the structure of what he had said. In the specifics. 4 minutes from point of injury in a level 1 center. She'd had 90 seconds and a dirt road. She'd known it. She had known it on some level for years. Knowing and believing were apparently different exercises, and apparently you could do one without the other for a very long time. She finished the cold coffee. She went home. She slept for 5 hours, which was 2 more than she usually managed after a night shift, and woke up to a message from the hospital's HR system. Formal notice of disciplinary review. Date TBD. Please acknowledge receipt. She acknowledged it. She made a second coffee, hot this time, and sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and started a document she'd been meaning to start for approximately 8 months. She called it simply Record, so began typing dates, incidents, patient outcomes, the gap between what she had done and what had been documented, the write-ups and the circumstances preceding each one. She was not a fast typist, but she was a precise one, and she worked through the morning without stopping, tracking back through her memory with the same systematic logic she brought to an assessment. The patterns, written down, were more visible than they'd been in her head. Every disciplinary report had followed a patient intervention that produced a positive outcome. Not sometimes. Every time. There was also a secondary pattern she hadn't fully clocked before. 4 other nurses, over the course of 2 years, had resigned or transferred out of the night shift ER. She'd noted their departures without connecting them. 2 of them she knew had military backgrounds. 1 had been a flight medic. She saved the document. She emailed it to herself and also saved a copy to a USB drive she kept in her kitchen drawer under a pile of takeout menus. At 7:20 a.m. she drove back to the hospital. Not for another shift. She had 17 hours before her next one. She drove back because she'd told Harlan to meet her there, and she did not like rescheduling. He was already in the parking lot when she arrived, leaning against the truck with a paper coffee cup in his hand, alone. The other 3 were presumably inside or still at the motel on Route 9. "You came back," he said. "I said I would." He handed her a second cup from the truck's cab. She took it, which she hadn't planned to do, but the gesture was too straightforward to decline. They sat on the low wall, the same one she'd been on 4 hours ago, and she asked him about Renner's mother, and he told her. The woman's name was Patricia. She lived in western Pennsylvania. She had received the standard notification, the standard benefits, the standard letter. She was not a person who expressed grief loudly, Harlan said. She was the kind who went quiet and stayed that way. He'd visited her once. It hadn't been easy for either of them. Does she know what happened, in detail? She knows he died serving. The specifics of the engagement are classified. Nora looked at her coffee cup. She should know someone was with him. Harlan was quiet for a moment. I've thought about that. I'll write a letter if you can get an address. You don't have to do that. I know. She looked at him. I want to. They were still talking about the engagement, about the extraction, about the 6 hours she barely remembered as a sequence, and mostly remembered as a series of immediate problems that needed immediate solutions. When a black SUV turned into the hospital parking lot and stopped in a visitor space near the main entrance, Nora watched it the way she watched anything unfamiliar that entered her space, automatically, without making it obvious. 2 people got out, suits. Professional, not local. One carried a leather folio. The other scanned the parking lot with the specific visual sweep of someone doing an assessment and not bothering to hide it. You know anyone who drives government plates? She asked Harlan without turning toward him. He looked. His posture didn't change, but something around his eyes did. That would be Colonel Vickers' office. You contacted the Army. Vickers contacted us. When word got to certain people about your employment situation, he stopped. There are things in motion that I should probably explain in order. Start talking. He did. The short version was that Nora's actions during the classified engagement 3 years ago had been reviewed twice at the command level, once immediately after, and once 8 months later when a formal commendation process was initiated and then stalled somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery of approvals and counter-approvals and jurisdictional questions about how you commended someone who was no longer active duty. The process had stalled, but the record existed. Her military file, her actual file, not the one that showed simply separated honorable discharge, contained testimonials from 6 surviving members of the unit, a field surgeon's after-action medical assessment, and a formal summary from her commanding officer that described her work that night in language that was, by military documentation standards, remarkably unambiguous. She had not known any of this. She had left the service with her discharge papers and the clothes she'd been wearing and the particular kind of silence that settles over a person who has decided to stop processing something until they're somewhere safe enough to try. She had been waiting 3 years to be somewhere safe enough. The 2 people from the SUV had gone inside. Nora looked at the main entrance doors. Through the glass, she could see the lobby, the information desk, the elevators, the corridor that led toward administration on the 2nd floor. What exactly is in motion? She asked. Harlan took a measured breath. As of yesterday, the Army submitted a formal record to Vantage General's administrative leadership. Commendation documents, unit testimonials, the field assessment, the contact at the advocacy organization. He paused. They also submitted to the state nursing board. Not a complaint, a context filing. A document that establishes the nature of your background and the pattern of outcomes in your ER employment and requests that any pending disciplinary actions be reviewed in that context. Nora set down her coffee cup. You did all of this, she said, while you were also driving 4 hours to find me at 3 in the morning. 3.5, Dix's voice came from behind her. She hadn't heard him approach. He was holding his own coffee and had apparently been listening for at least the last several minutes. He drives slow when he's thinking. I'm going to reassign you, Harlan said, without looking at him. Dick sat on the wall on Nora's other side. Yates and Bale are inside. Bale wanted to see the facility. Yates wanted a restroom. Which is Bale's version of what? Nora asked. Of making sure nobody in there does anything stupid while the colonel's people are in a meeting with your hospital administration. Nora absorbed that. Inside, at this moment, 2 people from a military office were presumably in a conference room with hospital leadership. Bale was somewhere in the building watching the hallways. Yates was in a restroom, or pretending to be. And Diane Rusk had just arrived for her shift. Nora could see her car pulling into the staff lot. The thing about watching someone's face when they don't know they're being watched was that you saw the unedited version. Diane got out of her car and checked her phone and walked toward the staff entrance with the gait of someone who owned the floor they walked on. The expression was already composed, already in charge. 12 years of it, the clipboard, the voice, the cultivated architecture of small diminishments. Nora had not figured out yet how she felt about what was happening, about soldiers driving through the night, about filings and records, and a process she'd had no part in initiating. There was something in it that was almost uncomfortable. She was used to managing her own problems quietly, and this was not quiet, and she had not controlled any of it. But Dennis Varick was alive. And somewhere in western Pennsylvania, Patricia Renner didn't yet know that her son had not died alone. And Diane Rusk was walking into a building where 2 people from the Army were sitting in a conference room with administration, and she had no idea. Nora picked up her coffee cup. "I want to see the documentation you submitted," she said to Harlan. "Everything." "It's in the truck." "Then let's go look at it." They were halfway across the parking lot when her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. She answered it anyway. "Ms. Callahan," a woman's voice, neutral, professional. "This is Deputy Director Okafor from the State Nursing Board's Investigative Division. I'm calling because we received a context filing yesterday evening, and we have some questions about the disciplinary history on your current file. Do you have time this morning to speak?" Nora stopped walking. Across the parking lot, Diane had reached the staff entrance and was badging in, and at the same moment, on the second floor, in a conference room Nora couldn't see, something was beginning that she also couldn't see, and the morning was accelerating in a direction she'd spent 3 years not letting herself imagine. "Yes," she said. "I have time." She looked up at the hospital, all 18 floors of it, the glass catching the early light, the sign at the entrance with the name on it that she'd walked under hundreds of times without feeling anything in particular. The call connected fully. And somewhere on the second floor, a door closed. Deputy Director Okafor had a voice built for delivering information without editorializing, and she used it efficiently. She asked Nora 11 questions over the course of 23 minutes, and Nora answered each one with the same precision she brought to a patient history. Dates, specifics, no embellishment, no omission. The call ended with Okafor saying she would be in touch within 48 hours, and Nora said that was fine, and hung up. Harlan had waited. He hadn't paced or checked his phone. He'd stood near the truck with his arms at his sides and watched the parking lot, with the particular patience of someone who had spent significant time waiting in conditions far worse than a Nevada hospital lot on a clear morning. "Nursing board," Nora said. "We figured they'd move fast." "How much of my employment record did you send them?" "Everything the advocacy organization had." "Which was your disciplinary file, cross-referenced against patient outcome data from public records. Discharge summaries, mortality stats, readmission rates." He paused. "You have a pattern, Nora. Not the pattern Rusk documented. The other one. The one where your patients consistently do better than baseline." She hadn't thought about it that way. She'd been managing individual situations, one shift at a time, one patient at a time. She hadn't been aggregating it because that wasn't how you survived inside a system that was already watching you for mistakes. "That kind of analysis takes time," she said. "We had 14 months. She looked at him. "We weren't just looking for you," he said. "We were building a picture, in case it was needed." He said it without apology, and she didn't ask for one because the picture, apparently, was needed. She got the documents from the truck. They stood at the tailgate, and she read through them in the morning light, and she did not rush it. The military files she'd never seen, the testimonials, 6 of them, each one formal in structure and blunt in content. Yates describing the femur fracture and the 43 meters, Dix describing the secondary position, Bale's account, which was 3 paragraphs long and more specific than the others about the timeline and the decisions she'd made and the order in which she'd made them. Harlan's own statement, which was the last one, the longest, and which she read twice. She handed the file back without commenting on it. Some things didn't have a response that was proportionate. "The people inside," she said. "Vickers' office. What exactly are they doing?" "Presenting the military commendation to hospital administration and requesting that your pending disciplinary review be suspended pending a full record review." He folded the file closed. "They're not ordering anything. They don't have that authority over a civilian hospital. But a formal request from that office with that documentation attached, carries its own weight. And if administration decides it doesn't? Then the nursing board's investigation proceeds independently, and the advocacy organization goes public with the pattern data. Nora absorbed this sequence. It was methodical. It had moving parts she hadn't designed and couldn't control, and the lack of control was producing a low-level friction in her chest that she recognized as her own particular brand of discomfort. She was not someone who'd ever been comfortable letting other people manage the field. "I need to go home and sleep," she said. "You should. Tell Bale to stop surveilling the second floor." Harlan's expression didn't exactly change. "I'll pass that along." She drove home. She slept 4 more hours, which brought her total to 9, which was more sleep than she'd gotten in any 36-hour period in recent memory. She woke up at 2 p.m. to 3 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, a voicemail from HR scheduling an emergency meeting for the following morning, and a text from the third-year resident, Tripp, that said only, "People are talking, heads up." She called him back. "What kind of talking?" she asked. "Military people were in Drexler's office this morning for like 2 hours. Dr. Drexler was the chief medical officer. Russ came in for her shift and someone told her, and she's been in her office since 11. He paused. "Also, Fowler's been weird all day." "Fowler's always weird." "Weirder. He went and pulled Varick's chart this morning, like voluntarily, sat with it for a while." Another pause. "I think he's trying to figure out how to feel about last night." "He doesn't need to feel any particular way about it. Varick lived." "Yeah, I know. I thought you should know what the temperature is in there." She thanked him and hung up. The HR meeting was at 9 the following morning. She set an alarm, made dinner, actual food, not cereal, which she considered a minor personal achievement, and spent the evening finishing the document she'd started that morning. Record. She added the phone call with Deputy Director Okafor. She added timestamps, case numbers where she had them, names. She printed 2 copies. One went into a folder, one went back onto the USB drive. She arrived at the hospital at 8:45 the next morning. She dressed deliberately, not to impress anyone, but because she was about to walk into a room where someone was going to try to make her feel small. And she had learned years ago that the way you occupied physical space mattered when someone was trying to reduce it. The HR office was on the 3rd floor, interior facing, no windows. The meeting was already assembled when she arrived. A woman from HR named Claudette, who had the demeanor of someone who'd conducted many of these meetings and found none of them pleasant. A hospital attorney named Shiv Patel, present as a clear signal that this had become a legal situation. And Diane Rusk, seated at the far end of the table with her clipboard on the surface in front of her and an expression of confident neutrality that she'd clearly been preparing since last night. There was also, to Nora's right, a woman she didn't recognize. Late 40s, reading glasses on a lanyard around her neck, a tablet in front of her, and the easy composure of someone attending a meeting where they held the advantage and knew it. "Ms. Callahan," Claudette began, "thank you for coming. This is a preliminary review of the formal complaint filed against you, and also an opportunity to address some additional items that have—" "Who is she?" Nora asked, looking at the woman with the tablet. The woman extended her hand across the table. "Margaret Solano. I'm with the Western Healthcare Workers Advocacy Coalition. I'm here as an independent observer at the request of the State Nursing Board's investigative office." She said this without inflection, the way you stated a fact about the weather. Diane's expression did not change, but something around her eyes did. "An observer," Patel said. We weren't notified." The nursing board filed notification at 7:45 this morning. Solano turned her tablet toward him briefly. "You're welcome to verify." The meeting began. It was not what Diane had prepared for. Claudette walked through the procedural elements. Patel offered legal context. Nora answered questions with the same directness she'd used with Deputy Director Okafor, referencing specific dates and outcomes, occasionally citing her printed record document, which she'd placed on the table in front of her at the start, and which Diane had looked at once and then looked away from. When it was Diane's turn to speak to the formal complaint, she did so with characteristic composure. The insubordination was real. The pattern was documented. Nora had been cautioned multiple times and had repeatedly placed her own clinical judgment above the chain of command, creating liability and undermining team function. It was well constructed. It would have been persuasive in a different room. Solano waited until Diane finished before she spoke, and she didn't look up from her tablet when she did. Charge Nurse Rusk, I'd like to ask about 4 nurses who resigned or transferred from the night shift ER in the past 22 months. She named them. 2 had military medical backgrounds. All 4 had written disciplinary reports in their files authored by you within 60 days of their departures. In 2 of those cases, formal complaints they had filed prior to departing were not entered into the HR system. She looked up. Can you explain the process by which incoming complaints are logged? Diane said, complaints are logged by the charge nurse and forwarded to HR within. Who determines whether a complaint meets the threshold for forwarding? A pause. The charge nurse exercises judgment. Is that judgment documented anywhere? Another pause. Nora watched Diane's face. The composure was still there, technically, but it was working harder than it had been at the start of the meeting. The meeting ran 90 minutes. At the end of it, Claudette announced that Nora's pending disciplinary review was formally suspended pending the completion of the nursing board's investigation. Nora's file would be flagged for independent review. She was to continue her normal work schedule. Patel asked whether this meant the complaints against Nora were considered withdrawn. Solano said that wasn't for her to characterize. They filed out of the conference room in a sequence that no one had arranged, but that felt somehow deliberate. Claudette first, then Patel, then Solano, then Nora, with Diane remaining seated at the table long enough that it was clear she was choosing not to leave at the same time as Nora. In the hallway, Solano fell into step beside her. The nursing board will want a formal interview within the week, she said. They'll contact you directly. Bring what you brought today, plus anything else you have. She glanced at Nora sidelong. You kept good records. I kept them late, Nora said. I should have started earlier. Most people don't start until they need to. Solano peeled off toward the elevators without ceremony. Nora's shift started at 11. She had 2 hours. She went to the cafeteria, ate something that was technically breakfast, and sat at a table by the window, watching the parking lot below. The familiar geometry of it, the staff entrance, the low wall where she'd sat twice now in 24 hours, the visitor spaces where a black SUV had been and wasn't anymore. Her phone lit up. Text from Harlan. Vickers' office says administration accepted the record. CMO is initiating an independent review of the ER conduct logs. Thought you should know. She typed back, thank you. Paused. Then added, all of you. She did not expect him to respond immediately, and he didn't. She finished eating and went down to the locker room and changed into her scrubs and tied her hair back and started her shift. The ER was busy by noon. It was always busy by noon. The morning injuries, the people who'd woken up sick and waited to see if it resolved and it hadn't, the afternoon overlap where 2 shifts of patients arrived simultaneously. Nora moved through it the way she always moved through it, which was to say, without wasted motion, reading the room, tracking the boards, picking up the things that were about to fall before they fell. Fowler was on. They hadn't spoken since the Varick case. He passed her at the nursing station at 12:30 without speaking. Then at 1:15 he stopped at the edge of her patient bay. She was assessing a 40-year-old woman with acute abdominal pain, and waited. She finished the assessment. She came out of the bay and faced him. You have something, he said. It wasn't a question. The way you work. I've been trying to figure out what to call it. Clinical judgment, she said. It's the same thing you have. It's not the same as mine, not exactly. He said this in the tone of someone making a technical observation, not a compliment, and she appreciated the distinction. Where did you train? Field medicine, mostly. He nodded slowly. He wasn't sure what to do with that, it showed, but he was trying to process it honestly, and she could see him doing it. That was something. Varick's wife called the unit this morning, he said. She wanted to thank the team. Good, Nora said. The charge nurse logged the call. She credited the resuscitation team. He paused. Your name wasn't in the log entry. Nora looked at him. He met her eyes. I'm going to put in an addendum, he said, to the resuscitation record. Your intervention, the fast suggestion. It should be in the clinical documentation. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, thank you. He nodded once and walked back toward the trauma bay. It was a small thing. It was also not a small thing. It was a physician going back into a chart and correcting the record on his own initiative, without being asked, because it was accurate. In this particular environment, at this particular moment, that meant something. She had 40 minutes of relative calm before the ambulance bay doors opened again. The paramedics brought in a 61-year-old woman, a schoolteacher named Joellen Marsh, according to the ID in her wallet, who had collapsed during a faculty meeting and presented with altered consciousness, a blood pressure reading of 210/115, and a focal deficit on the left side that her husband, following the ambulance in his own car, described as she just dropped her coffee and then she couldn't talk right. Stroke protocol went active. The stroke team was paged. The CT was being prepped. Nora was doing the intake assessment when she noticed the patient's right pupil. The left was reactive, sluggish but responsive. The right was fixed and mid-dilated and had been since the moment she'd first checked. Not the presentation of an ischemic stroke where you'd expect pupils to track together. This was unilateral and fixed in a way that made her look again at the blood pressure, the sudden onset, the focal deficit. Subarachnoid hemorrhage, a bleed in the space between the brain and the surrounding membrane, the kind that happened fast and without warning and had a survival rate that dropped precipitously with every minute of delayed treatment. She said it aloud immediately. "I need neurosurgery on the phone now. This isn't ischemic. Her right pupil is fixed. BP at 210 with sudden severe onset. We need to be thinking SAH." The attending on the stroke protocol was Dr. Priya Vasan, a neurologist Nora had worked with maybe a dozen times. Vasan was sharp and knew it, and generally preferred to reach her own conclusions. She looked at the pupil herself, looked at the B, looked at the onset timeline the husband had provided. "Get me neurosurgery," she said. 2 seconds of silence, then, "Now." The CT confirmed it. A ruptured aneurysm, right middle cerebral artery, with blood in the subarachnoid space already spreading. Joellen Marsh went to neurosurgical intervention 41 minutes after she'd come through the doors, which was within the window that gave her a realistic chance at a meaningful recovery. Afterward, Dr. Vasan found Nora at the charting station. "You called that before the imaging," Vasan said. "The pupil was the tell. I would have caught it in the CT." A pause. "But the CT would have been another 8 minutes. That 8 minutes matters." She said this with the directness of someone recalibrating, not conceding. "How'd you pattern match that fast?" Trauma background. "You see a lot of head injuries in the field. The pupil presentation sticks." Vasan nodded. She stood there a moment longer than the conversation required. "I heard there was a meeting this morning with HR." "There was." "And military people yesterday?" "Yes." Vasan looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between assessment and something more personal. "I've worked next to you for 8 months," she said. "I didn't know any of that about you." "It didn't come up," Nora said. "No." Vasan picked up her own chart. "I suppose it didn't." The shift ended at 7. Nora finished charting at 7:40, which meant she was 40 minutes into unpaid overtime again. But the SAH documentation needed to be complete, and she was not leaving it half done. She logged out, changed, walked out through the staff entrance into an evening that had gotten cold since morning. She was in her car, key in the ignition, when her phone rang. "Harlan." She answered. "What?" His voice was level. The specific leveling that she associated with people who had been trained to deliver bad news without inflection so that the information came through clean. "Administration completed an emergency audit of the ER conduct logs today. They found irregularities." He paused. "Not small ones. The attorney they brought in to review the documentation. They're calling it systematic falsification, not just your file." Nora stared through the windshield at the staff parking lot. The light was going orange at the edges. "How many files?" "At least 11, possibly more. They're still going through them." Another pause. "Nora, they suspended Rusk 20 minutes ago, pulled her badge, security walked her out." She didn't respond immediately. "The CMO is convening a full administrative review board tomorrow morning," Harlan continued. "The nursing board's investigator is coming in person, and the hospital attorney has been on the phone with the state attorney general's office for the last 2 hours. The attorney general's office. This had stopped being a hospital HR matter. This was, apparently, a criminal matter. "What was in the other files?" she asked. "Falsified incident reports, suppressed complaints, manipulated staffing records used to justify removing nurses from certain assignments." He stopped. "One of them, from about 14 months ago, a nurse named Petra Yun, who resigned after a disciplinary cascade that Rusk authored. She filed a complaint through external channels before she left. The hospital has no record of receiving it because it was routed to Rusk's inbox and deleted. Nora felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the Nevada evening air. Deleted, she said. The IT forensic team found the original timestamp in the deleted files folder. He paused. There's more, but the attorney advised that you shouldn't hear the specifics until you've had your own counsel review your options. I don't have an attorney. The Advocacy Coalition can refer someone, tonight if you need it. She sat in the car for a moment without speaking. Through the windshield, the staff entrance doors opened and two nurses came out, day shift, going home, talking about something that made one of them laugh. Normal. Ordinary. Reed. She used his first name without planning to. How much of this? The investigation, the file review, the AG contact. How much of this would have happened without you showing up? A pause. Honestly? Yes. The nursing board might have gotten there eventually. The external complaint from Yoon was already in the system, technically. Someone might have found it. He said this with the fairness of someone trying to be accurate rather than modest. But Rusk would have had your job first, and the other files might have stayed buried for years. Another pause. We accelerated it. That's the honest answer. She looked at the staff entrance doors. The two nurses were gone. I need to think, she said. Okay. Tell Bale to stop watching the building. A beat. He's not... He stopped. I'll tell him. She hung up. She sat in the parking lot for another 4 minutes, looking at the hospital's 18 floors lit up against the darkening sky. Somewhere in there, on the second floor, there was a conference room where tomorrow morning people were going to sit down with files that Diane Rusk had been sure would never see daylight. And somewhere in the building, possibly still in the ER, possibly already transferred, Joellen Marsh was in a recovery unit with a neurosurgical team managing a bleed that 8 minutes could have made untreatable. And Dennis Varick was in a room somewhere with a thigh wound and an abdomen that was healing, and no idea that the nurse who'd kept him alive was sitting in a parking lot at 7:45 on a cold Nevada evening trying to figure out how she felt about the fact that the world, apparently, was finally paying attention. She started the car. She was 3 blocks from the hospital when her radio scanner, an old habit, a civilian one she'd never quite dropped, picked up the frequency. Vehicle accident, multi-car. Highway 9 eastbound. At least 3 vehicles, possible entrapments, multiple casualties reported. And then the dispatcher's voice, reading off a name from a vehicle registration pulled at the scene. Diane Rusk. Nora turned the car around. She did it without deliberating, without running the calculation out loud in her head. The scanner was still going, units responding, ETA estimates, a second call coming in from a civilian who'd stopped at the scene describing multiple people trapped. She turned east on Highway 9 and pushed the speed up and called the ER as she drove. Tripp answered. He was still there, apparently, which was either dedication or a sign that his social life was in worse shape than hers. Multi-vehicle on Highway 9, she said. How many trauma bays do you have open? A pause, the sound of him moving. 1 clear, 1 semi. Fowler's on. Why are you... I'll be there before the ambulances. Tell Fowler. She hung up. The road east out of Crestfall was 4 lanes that thinned to 2 after the commercial strip ended, and at nearly 8 p.m. on a weeknight there was enough traffic that she could see the pattern of stopped cars about a mile ahead before she saw anything else. Headlights in wrong orientations, someone's hazards going, the blue-white strobe of a single police unit already on scene. She pulled onto the shoulder, grabbed the emergency kit she kept in the back seat, an old habit she'd never stopped maintaining, and got out. The accident was 3 vehicles. A pickup that had rear-ended a sedan at speed, pushing the sedan into the concrete median barrier. A third car, a blue hatchback, had swerved to avoid the collision and gone sideways into the guardrail on the opposite shoulder. The pickup driver was out of his vehicle, standing with his hands on the roof of his truck, not visibly injured but not moving purposefully either. The sedan was the worst of it. Front end compromised, driver's airbag deployed. The driver slumped in a way that meant either unconscious or worse. The hatchback was Diane Rusk's car. Nora knew the car. Dark gray, a dent on the rear bumper that had been there since last winter. She'd seen it in the staff lot hundreds of times. She went to the sedan first because that was the most critical presentation. The officer on scene, young, a year or two on the job at most by the look of him, was at the sedan window trying to communicate with the driver. Nora came up beside him. "I'm a trauma nurse," she said. "Let me look." He stepped back without argument, which meant he was scared enough to be grateful. The sedan's driver was a man in his 50s, breathing. She could see the rise of his chest, unconscious. There was a laceration above his right eye, producing significant bleeding, which looked dramatic but wasn't the immediate concern. His neck was in an awkward angle against the headrest. His left arm was positioned wrong, and not because of how he'd slumped. The geometry was off in a way that made her assess the shoulder and clavicle before anything else. She couldn't extract him. She didn't try. Without a board, without a collar, moving a potentially cervical spine-injured patient alone on a highway shoulder was a decision that could paralyze someone who would otherwise walk out of a hospital. She stabilized his head from outside the window, manually, both hands, holding the position while she talked to him. "Sir, can you hear me? My name is Nora. I'm a nurse. I need you to try to squeeze my finger if you can hear me." Nothing for 4 seconds. Then his right hand moved. Barely, but it moved. "That's good. Don't try to turn your head. Help is coming. I've got you." She heard the hatchback's door open behind her. Diane Rusk got out of her own car unassisted. She was moving stiffly. Right arm held close to her body, a cut on her forehead that had bled down the side of her face and dried in the cold air. She was upright, ambulatory. Her eyes were tracking. Their eyes met across the accident scene. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The officer's radio was going. Someone in the distance was calling out. The sedan driver's breathing was audible and regular in the space between everything else. Diane looked at Nora's hands, both of them braced against the sedan driver's head, holding his cervical spine in neutral. And something crossed her face that was too complicated to name. She looked away first. Nora kept holding the position. Her arms would be tired in another 4 minutes. She had probably 8 until EMS arrived based on the response time she'd heard on the scanner. She adjusted her grip fractionally and kept talking to the sedan driver in a low, steady voice that was mostly for him and partly because it helped her focus. The first ambulance arrived in 6 minutes. The paramedics took over the sedan driver's manual stabilization and got a collar on him while Nora stepped back and gave them a rapid verbal handoff. GCS on arrival, response to stimulus, the left shoulder geometry, the head lack, respiratory rate and quality. One of them, a paramedic named Osvaldo, who she'd worked with on multiple calls, absorbed it without writing anything down and immediately incorporated it into his assessment. "You driving tonight?" he asked her. "I was heading home." He gave her a look that contained several things, including respect and mild disbelief, and went back to his patient. The sedan driver went into the first ambulance. The pickup driver declined transport. He had a bruised wrist and the kind of shaken affect that would probably produce a delayed headache in a few hours. But he was alert and his pupils were equal and reactive, and he had someone coming to get him. That left the hatchback. Nora walked over. Diane was sitting on the guardrail. She'd found something, a cloth from her car, it looked like, and was pressing it to the forehead cut. Her right arm was still held close. Her color was off, the particular pallor that showed up when pain was significant and the body was working to manage it. Nora crouched to eye level. Clinical assessment, not a conversation. "Can you take a deep breath for me?" Diane looked at her. Her expression was hard to read. Not hostile, not grateful. Something more stripped down than either of those things. She took the breath. It was shallow on the right side. "Your right arm. Is the pain in the arm or in your chest?" "Both." Her voice was flat. "On a scale, 7. Diane said it before Nora finished the question. Nora palpated the right clavicle gently. Diane flinched but held still. There was a deformity at the midshaft, a fracture, likely. The ribs were harder to assess through a coat, but the asymmetric breathing and the pain radiating into the chest suggested at minimum a couple of cracked ribs on the right side, possibly more. "You need imaging," Nora said. "Chest and shoulder. I don't think you've got a pneumothorax, but the rib pattern needs a film." "I know what I need," Diane said. "Then get in the second ambulance." A pause. "You should go. You don't have to be here." Nora looked at her. "You're my patient right now. We can talk about everything else later or never. I don't care which. But right now you need transport, and I'm the medical person on scene until the second unit takes you." Something moved behind Diane's eyes. It lasted about a second. Then she got up from the guardrail slowly, favoring the left side, and walked toward the second ambulance under her own power. Nora followed. She gave the paramedic the handoff. Clavicle fracture probable, right-sided rib injury, asymmetric respirations, no LOC, ambulatory and alert. She watched them get Diane into the unit. As the doors were closing, Diane looked at her once more through the gap. She didn't say anything. Nora didn't either. The doors closed. Nora stood on the highway shoulder with the cold coming up from the asphalt and the last of the emergency lights strobing across her face, and then she drove to the hospital. Not because she'd been asked, not because anyone had called her back in. She drove back because there were 2 incoming traumas and the department was going to be short, and that was the arithmetic of it. Simple as that. Fowler was waiting at the ambulance bay. "You were at the scene?" he said. "I was driving past." The sedan driver. C-spine precautions from point of contact. Left clavicle's my concern more than the shoulder geometry. The position suggested the joint absorbed the door rather than the harness. Check the AC joint on imaging. Fowler blinked. "Okay." He turned back toward the bay. "Fowler." He stopped. "The second transport. The patient's a Vantage General employee. It's Rusk." A longer pause than she expected. "Does she know you're here?" "She was conscious and alert when I handed her off at the scene. She knows." He looked at Nora for a moment. Whatever he was working through internally, he didn't share it. He just nodded and went back inside. The sedan driver's name turned out to be Harold Fenn. He had a fractured clavicle that matched Nora's field suspicion, a mild concussion, and 3 cracked ribs on the left side from the door. His cervical spine was intact, which meant the manual stabilization had done its job, which meant Harold Fenn was going to be walking around in 6 weeks with a complaint about his shoulder instead of a spinal injury. Diane arrived 14 minutes after Harold and was taken to a separate bay. Nora was managing the flow of the department and was not assigned to Diane's bay and did not insert herself into it. She caught glimpses through the bay curtain when it moved. Diane sitting up on the gurney, answering questions, the controlled expression still there even in a hospital gown with a monitor lead on her chest. The night resident handling Diane's case came to find Nora around 9:30. "She's asking for you," the resident said. She had the expression of someone delivering a message they found confusing. "Is she medically stable?" "Clavicle fracture, 3 right side ribs, no pneumo. We're going to admit her overnight for observation, but she's stable." Nora finished the chart she was updating, set down the tablet, walked to Diane's bay. Diane was alone. The monitor was running, heart rate, oxygen sat, a blood pressure that was coming down from the elevated reading they'd probably gotten on arrival. She looked smaller in the gown. Not diminished, just accurate maybe. The size she actually was, without the clipboard and the composure and the years of constructed authority. Nora stood at the foot of the gurney. She did not sit. "You stabilized his neck," Diane said. "At the scene, the man in the sedan." "Yes." "You came over to me after." "You were injured." Diane looked at the monitor on the wall. Her jaw moved once. "I heard you give the handoff to the paramedic. About me." She paused. "It was accurate." "I know." A longer silence. The monitor beeped steadily. Somewhere in the department, something clattered. "I'm going to ask you something," Diane said, "and I'd like an honest answer." Nora waited. "Did you know it was me in that car before you came over?" "Yes," Nora said. Diane absorbed this. She looked at the monitor again, then back at Nora. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find it, or to stop looking for it, which was maybe the same thing. "I filed those reports," she said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a defense either. It landed as something closer to a plain statement of fact. "I knew what I was doing." Nora said nothing. "I'm not asking you to—" Diane stopped, started differently. "I'm not asking for anything. I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of what's coming. What I did." She looked down at her left hand, which was the one she could move. "I wanted to say that in the same room as you, before it becomes whatever it's going to become." Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "Okay." She turned and left the bay. She wasn't sure what she felt about that exchange. Not satisfied, not unresolved, somewhere in between. In the complicated territory of things, that were true and terrible and not fully processable inside a single night shift in a department that still had 6 patients on the board. She went back to work. The Administrative Review Board convened at 8 the following morning. Nora was not in the meeting. She was on shift, and the meeting was not her meeting to attend. But she knew it was happening because Harlan texted at 8:04. They're starting, and because Margaret Solano was in the building again, this time with a colleague, both of them heading toward the second-floor conference room with the brisk purpose of people with a defined agenda and limited patience. The review board ran 4 hours. Nora learned the contents piecemeal, the way you learned most things in a hospital, through hallway conversations, through the resident who overheard things at the elevator, through Harlan, who had his own channels, and was apparently still in Crestfall at the motel on Route 9 with no visible plans to leave. The findings were not small. The IT forensic team had recovered 11 deleted complaints from Diane's hospital email archive. 7 of the 11 were from nurses. 2 were from nursing assistants. 1 was from a third-year resident, not Tripp, who had raised concerns about patient safety during a specific night shift 2 years ago and had resigned 3 months later following a disciplinary write-up he'd attributed in an exit interview to retaliation. The complaint he'd filed internally had been deleted 4 days after he submitted it. Of the 11 complaints, 4 had been filed by nurses with military or veteran backgrounds. 2 of those 4 had been escalated by Diane to HR with added documentation that Nora now recognized as a signature approach. Vague language about professional conduct, references to team function. Nothing specific enough to contest, but specific enough to damage. In both cases, the nurses had left within 60 days. The board also reviewed the staffing records. What emerged there was worse, in some ways, because it was more systematic. Diane had been selectively manipulating overnight staffing assignments for at least 3 years. Not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger obvious review, but consistently. Experienced nurses with clinical intervention patterns similar to Nora's had been scheduled into situations that maximized conflict potential. Short-staffed nights, high-acuity loads with inadequate physician coverage, environments where any deviation from rigid protocol would read as insubordination rather than clinical judgment. It was not sloppy. It had been done carefully by someone who understood the system well enough to game it without tripping the systems designed to catch gaming. The CMO, Dr. Drexler, issued a statement to department heads by noon. Nora read it on the internal communication system during her lunch break. It was written in the measured language of institutions managing crises, but the substance was unambiguous. The ER night shift had been operating under a compromised supervisory structure. An independent nursing leadership review would begin immediately. All personnel decisions made by the suspended charge nurse over the prior 36 months were under administrative review. Any staff member with relevant information was encouraged to contact the review board directly through a protected channel. The state nursing board's investigator arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Her name was Sable Okafor, the same deputy director who'd called Nora on the phone 2 days ago. And she came in person this time, which meant the investigation had reached the stage where phone calls were no longer sufficient. She met with Nora in a side room off the main corridor at 3:15, between Nora's patient assessments, and the meeting lasted 20 minutes. Nora brought the printed record document and a second document she'd compiled that morning, a timeline of patient outcomes correlating to incidents in her disciplinary file. The same analysis Harlan's team had done, but in her own words and from her own recollection. Okafor read both documents with the focused efficiency of someone who processed a lot of paper and had learned to identify what mattered. "I want to ask you about Petra Yoon," Okafor said. Nora had been expecting this. "I knew her, briefly. She transferred onto night shift about 6 months before she left. She was good. Flight medic background, very clean assessment instincts. Did you know she'd filed a complaint?" "Not until 2 nights ago." "Did you have any contact with her after she left?" "No, I didn't have her personal contact information. We weren't close. We'd worked together maybe 15 times. Nora paused. "I noticed when she left. I didn't know why. I assumed it was what it usually is. Someone decides the environment isn't worth it and moves somewhere else." The complaint she filed detailed a pattern of targeted scheduling and documentation manipulation that aligns closely with what we're finding in the administrative review. Okafor set down the papers. "Ms. Callahan, I want to be direct with you. The nursing board is going to proceed with a formal disciplinary review against Diane Rusk. Based on what we have, the most likely outcome is license revocation. That process takes time and it has formal steps, but I want you to understand the direction. Nora looked at her. What about the deleted complaints? That's not a licensing matter. No, that's a criminal matter. That's not in my jurisdiction. Okafor paused. But I spoke with the AG's office this morning. They're aware. The meeting ended. Nora went back to her patients. By 4 in the afternoon, the hospital's internal communication board, the informal one, the unit group chats and break room conversations, was fully activated in the way it only got when something significant had shifted. Nora could feel it in the department, the change in atmosphere that wasn't about any single conversation, but about the aggregate of many. People were looking at her differently. Not all of them. Some were keeping their heads down in the careful way of people who weren't sure yet which way things were going to settle, but enough that she noticed. Tripp found her at the nursing station at 4:30. He had the look of someone who'd been wanting to say something for most of the day, and had been waiting for the right moment. "I have something," he said. He was keeping his voice low, which was unnecessary since the station was empty, but she didn't point that out. "About Rusk. It's been bothering me." "Tell me." 2 years ago, I was a first year just rotated through the ER. There was an incident, a patient who arrested, and the response was delayed because the crash cart had been moved and nobody knew where it was. He paused. An incident report was filed. I know it was filed because I watched the charge nurse on that shift fill it out. The chart shows the arrest, the chart shows the response, and the outcome. He stopped again. The incident report about the cart location doesn't exist in the system. I looked it up last week when all of this started, and it's not there. Who was charge nurse that shift? Rusk. He looked uncomfortable, the way people looked when they'd been holding something and were finally setting it down. I didn't connect it at the time. I was a first year, and I didn't know what I was looking at. I knew something was off, and I filed it somewhere in my brain, and I didn't look at it again until now. You need to tell the review board, Nora said. Not me, them, today. I know. I just wanted to... He stopped. I know, she said. Tell them. He nodded and walked toward the administrative corridor. Nora stood at the nursing station for a moment. The department moved around her. The ordinary motion of an ER in mid-afternoon, patients and gurneys, and the percussion of the monitor alarms cycling through their frequencies. She thought about the crash cart. She thought about the kind of institutional negligence that didn't announce itself, that hid inside the regular noise of a busy department until a first-year resident noticed something was off and didn't know what to do with it and carried it for 2 years. She thought about how many other first-year residents, how many other nurses, how many other things. Her shift ended at 7. She stayed until 7:50, finishing documentation, and then changed and walked out through the staff entrance and called Harlan from the parking lot. The board found 11 deleted complaints, she said. One was from a resident. There may be more from the crash cart incident 2 years ago. I heard. Solano's been in contact with the board chair. A pause. There's something else. The hospital's insurance carrier has opened their own investigation. Why? Because if Rusk's falsification of incident reports suppressed documentation of patient safety events, and the crash cart situation is exactly that kind of event, then the hospital has potential liability exposure that the carrier needs to assess independently. He paused. This is getting larger than a personnel matter, Nora. I know. You doing okay? She considered the question seriously rather than deflecting it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think I need it to finish before I'll know. That's fair? She got in her car. She was almost at the hospital exit when her phone rang again. Not Harlan this time. The number was Vantage General's main line. She answered. It was Claudette from HR. Her voice had lost the administrative neutral it had carried in the meeting 2 days ago. She sounded like someone delivering news they hadn't expected to be delivering. Ms. Callahan, I'm sorry to call after hours. I wanted to inform you before it becomes public tomorrow morning. A pause. The board has concluded the emergency administrative review. 2 senior administrators, Deputy Administrator Greer and the Director of Nursing Operations, Hendricks, have been placed on immediate administrative leave pending further review. We've also... She stopped, started again. We've also contacted the State AG's office and voluntarily turned over the full document forensics. Nora pulled to a stop at the parking lot exit. Voluntarily, she said. Yes. Before they requested it. Yes. Claudette's voice was precise. The board's counsel advised that voluntary cooperation represented the appropriate course. Nora sat with that for a moment. Two senior administrators, the director of nursing operations, voluntary disclosure to the Attorney General. There's one more thing, Claudette said, and I want to be careful about how I say this because nothing is formal yet and the process has steps. Another pause. The board has asked me to communicate that they intend to initiate a full remediation of your personnel file. Every disciplinary entry authored by Rusk will be reviewed for accuracy. The board has authorized removal of any entry that cannot be independently substantiated. Her voice was even. I also want to say personally that I'm sorry it took this long. Nora did not respond to the last part, not because she didn't hear it, but because she wasn't sure the right response existed. Thank you for calling, she said. She hung up. She sat at the parking lot exit for another moment and then turned onto the street. She was 4 blocks from home when she remembered something. She pulled over and looked it up on her phone, the contact database from the Advocacy Coalition, which Solano had sent her. She found what she was looking for and saved it. Patricia Renner, Western Pennsylvania. An address. She'd told Harlan she would write a letter. She was going to write a letter. But first, she was going to go home and sit down and eat something that wasn't vending machine food, and give herself approximately 45 minutes to exist outside of the machinery of everything that was in motion. The board review, the AG investigation, the insurance inquiry, the nursing board, the 11 deleted complaints, the administrator leaves, the remediation of her file, all of it, before it started again tomorrow. She was 3 blocks from her apartment when the hospital's emergency channel notification hit her phone. She had it set for major alerts only. The alert category read, Code Red, ER, multiple incoming trauma. All available staff respond. And then, 2 seconds later, a second notification. This one from Harlan. Turn on local news. Now. She pulled over and turned on the radio. The local news station was mid-broadcast, the anchor's voice carrying the clipped urgency that meant something had broken fast, and they were still assembling the full picture. A chemical plant on the eastern edge of Crestfall, a facility that processed industrial solvents, had experienced a pressure failure in one of its storage units. The failure had triggered a partial structural collapse in the adjacent building. Preliminary reports from first responders indicated between 20 and 40 workers had been inside at the time of the incident. Multiple confirmed injuries, unknown number of entrapments, potential chemical exposure, the specific agents not yet identified. Nora was already moving before the anchor finished the sentence. She called the ER while she drove. Fowler picked up, which meant he'd grabbed the nearest phone, which meant the department was already mobilizing and nobody was sitting at the desk. How many do you have coming? She asked. First wave 8, second wave unknown. We're pulling in everyone we can reach. Ortho and Gen Surg are coming in. We've activated the mass casualty protocol. His voice was tight but functional. Where are you? 4 minutes out. What's the exposure agent? They're saying methyl ethyl ketone and a petroleum distillate blend. Possible hydrogen sulfide in the collapsed section. That part's not confirmed. Methyl ethyl ketone was manageable with standard decontamination. Hydrogen sulfide was a different category of problem entirely. Colorless, fast-acting, capable of incapacitating someone before they recognized what was happening. If workers in the collapsed section had been exposed, they weren't going to be presenting with burns or lacerations. They were going to be presenting with pulmonary compromise and neurological effects and blood pressure instability that could be misread as trauma shock if you weren't looking for the right things. Tell the incoming teams to assume possible H2S in any patient from the East Building, she said. Symptom cluster will look like rapid onset pulmonary edema plus altered mental status. It'll mimic blast concussion, but the respiratory component will be earlier and more severe. They need 100% oxygen immediately, not standard supplemental. A beat. How do you know H2S presentation? I've seen it. Just tell them. She hung up. She was at the hospital in 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The ambulance bay was already organized chaos, the particular texture of a mass casualty event in its early stage, when the systems were engaging but the patient volume hadn't yet outpaced them. Nora badged in through the staff entrance, went to the locker room, changed back into scrubs in 90 seconds, and came onto the floor. The charge nurse covering Diane's suspended position was a man named Grant Puller, who'd been pulled from the day shift and looked mildly overwhelmed in the way of someone capable enough, but not accustomed to running the board in this volume. He saw Nora come through the door, and the relief on his face was immediate and unperformed. "Tell me where you want me," she said. "Bay 3 is yours. We've got a decon line running in the parking structure. Facilities set it up in the last 15 minutes. First patients are going to start landing in about 4 minutes." She went to Bay 3. She checked the equipment, oxygen setup, IV access, the monitoring leads, the crash cart position. Everything was where it should be. She repositioned the oxygen delivery setup for faster access and checked the dosing on the high-flow mask because in an H2S exposure case, the delivery method mattered as much as the oxygen concentration. The first patient in her bay was a 26-year-old named Marcus, who'd been in the East Building when the collapse happened. He came in with altered mental status, confused, not fully oriented to where he was, oxygen saturation at 84% on room air, and a respiratory rate of 32. His skin had the early cherry red tinge that sometimes showed up with certain toxic exposures. The paramedic who brought him in had already started supplemental oxygen in the field, but not high flow. Nora switched him to a non-rebreather at 15 liters per minute before she'd finished the handoff. "He needs a cyanide kit," she said to the resident who materialized at her elbow. The resident blinked. Hydrogen sulfide exposure mechanism overlaps with cyanide toxicity at the cellular level. Hydroxycobalamin. Get pharmacy on the phone now, and get me a venous blood gas. The resident went. Nora talked to Marcus. He couldn't answer full questions, but he could track her voice, which was something. She held his wrist, not for the pulse, she had the monitor for that, just to give him something human to orient to while his brain tried to function with insufficient oxygen and a cellular metabolism that was being actively disrupted. "Marcus, you're at the hospital. We're giving you oxygen. You're going to feel the breathing get easier. Try to stay with me." His grip on her wrist was weak but present. The next 2 hours were the kind that compressed time. Nora managed her bay through 5 patients in rapid succession. The H2S exposure cases, 2 crush injuries from the structural collapse, a worker with a partial thickness chemical burn across her forearm, and a man in his 50s with suspected myocardial infarction triggered by the stress of the event, which was a different kind of emergency running in parallel to all the others. She called the interventions as she assessed, worked with the residents and the incoming specialists, and did not pause to process any of it because the processing happened later, in the car or in the kitchen, or at 4 a.m. when the shift was over. During the work itself, there was only the work. Fowler moved through the department with the focused energy of a physician who was, whatever his other qualities, genuinely excellent under pressure. She'd seen it in the Varick case, and she saw it again now. The way he prioritized, the speed and accuracy of his triage decisions, the particular lack of wasted movement that separated good trauma physicians from average ones. They worked around each other through the evening without needing to narrate it, falling into a clinical rhythm that was purely functional and therefore, in its own way, honest. At one point, moving between bays, he stopped beside her for approximately 4 seconds. "The H2S call," he said. "Right." She was already moving. "I know." Marcus, the 26-year-old from the East Building, stabilized within 90 minutes of arrival. His oxygen saturation climbed to 97% on the high-flow mask, and by the time the hydroxycobalamin had run and the follow-up gas showed improving values, he was answering questions in full sentences and asking whether someone had called his wife. "I'll call her," Nora said. She did. From the nursing station standing up between 2 other tasks. Marcus's wife was named Delphine, and she was on the other end of the phone, doing the controlled breathing of someone trying not to fall apart. And Nora told her that Marcus was stable, that he was awake and asking for her, and that she should drive carefully because the roads near the plant were going to be congested, and arriving in one piece was what he actually needed. A pause. Then Delphine said, "Thank you. Who are you?" "I'm his nurse, Nora Callahan." Another pause. "Thank you, Nora Callahan." She hung up and went back to work. The mass casualty event wound down the way those events always did. Not dramatically, not with a clear moment of resolution, but in increments as the incoming volume slowed and the existing patients stabilized or were transferred or were admitted to floors where other teams took over. By 11 p.m., the department was busy in its regular way rather than its emergency way, and the borrowed staff were heading back to their home units or their homes, and the decontamination line in the parking structure was being broken down. Grant Puller found her at 11:15. He'd been running the board all evening, and he looked like it, his eyes carrying the particular tiredness of sustained administrative concentration. "I'm putting you in the incident report as primary clinical coordinator for the toxic exposure cases," he said. "That's going in the mass casualty documentation. You don't need to—" "Yes, I do. You called the H2S mechanism when nobody else had connected it yet. That determination changed the treatment approach for at least 6 patients tonight." He was not being gracious about it. He was being accurate. "That goes in the documentation." She looked at him for a moment. "Okay." "Also, Fowler put in a formal addendum to the Varick chart yesterday. I saw it in the system this morning." He paused. "He also sent a note to the review board, voluntarily, I was told, about what he observed during the Varick resuscitation, his characterization of your intervention." He stopped. "I don't know how much that matters to you. I thought you should know." She didn't know how much it mattered. It was complicated, the way most things that arrived late were complicated. She thought about saying something that captured that and then didn't, because it was 11:15 and she'd been on her feet for 14 hours, and some things could wait. "Thanks, Grant," she said. She finished charting at midnight. She changed. She walked out. Harlan was in the parking lot. Not all of them this time. Just him, leaning against the truck, which she was starting to recognize as his default operating position whenever he was outside. He handed her a coffee cup when she got close enough, and she took it without breaking stride. "The plant incident," he said. 22 patients total, 18 discharged or transferred, 4 admissions, 2 of those ICU. Fatalities? None. She said it without emphasis. It was the number. 2 of the ICU patients are the H2S exposures. They'll need monitoring for delayed pulmonary effects over the next 48 hours, but the projections are good. He nodded. They sat on the low wall. It had become, she realized, something of a default location for the 2 of them, which was either meaningful or just geography. She drank the coffee. It was better than the hospital's, which meant he'd gone somewhere to get it, which meant he'd been waiting long enough to do that. "The review board issued a preliminary finding tonight," he said. "Solano sent it to me about an hour ago." She looked at him. "Rusk's license suspension has been escalated to emergency interim revocation by the nursing board. That's effective immediately, pending the formal hearing. The formal hearing is scheduled for 32 days out." He paused. "The AG's office has confirmed they're opening a criminal investigation. Falsification of official records, suppression of legally mandated safety documentation, potentially fraud. If the staffing manipulation can be shown to have affected billing or compliance reports." The night air was cold and clear. Across the parking lot, the hospital lights were on across all 18 floors. "Greer and Hendricks," she said, "the administrators. Still on leave. Counsel is advising them separately. Whether the AG's investigation includes them depends on what the document forensics show about who had access to what." He looked at his own coffee cup. "The hospital's insurance carrier completed their preliminary assessment. They're recommending a comprehensive review of all incident reports from the past 4 years. 4 years. That was before Nora had even been hired. "Petra Yoon," she said. "The Advocacy Coalition reached out to her yesterday. She's in Arizona now, working at a community clinic. She knows what's happening." A pause. "She said she was glad." Nora sat with that. She thought about what it meant to be glad from a distance, to hear that the thing you'd tried to report had finally surfaced, that the deleted complaint had been found, that somebody was being held to it. She thought about whether glad was the right word for that, or whether it was just the closest available one. "The other nurses who left," she said. "The ones from the discharge list. The coalition is reaching out to all of them. Anyone whose departure followed a Rusk disciplinary write-up. They're being notified and given the option to submit supplementary information to the nursing board review." He paused. 3 of them have already responded. 2 are considering returning to hospital nursing. 1 just wanted to know that it happened. She finished the coffee. The cup was warm in her hands for another minute after it was empty. "I need to write that letter," she said. "For Patricia Renner. I have her address when you're ready." "I'm ready." She looked at him. "Tonight's not the night, but soon." He nodded. He understood the difference. She went home. She slept 7 hours, the most consecutive sleep she'd gotten since before the Varick case, and woke up to a morning that was ordinary in the way mornings rarely felt after the kind of week she'd had. She made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened the laptop and started the letter to Patricia Renner, and she wrote it without stopping and without reading it back until she'd finished. Because the reading back could be done cold, but the writing had to be done in one motion or she would find reasons to stop. It was 4 paragraphs. It described who Nora was and where she had been and what she had done and tried to do, and that Patrick Renner had not been alone, and that she had thought about him every day since. It did not ask for forgiveness because that was not her ask to make. It offered the truth, which was the only thing she actually had to give. She printed it. She addressed an envelope. She put a stamp on it and drove to the post office that morning before her afternoon shift. On the way back, her phone rang. Claudette, from HR. The formal remediation process has started, Claudette said. I wanted to walk you through the timeline. It took 12 days in the end. 12 days of review, cross-reference, independent substantiation attempts for each of the 4 disciplinary entries in Nora's file. 3 of the 4 had been authored entirely by Diane Rusk. The 4th had a co-signature from Hendricks, one of the administrators on administrative leave. None of the 4 could be substantiated by independent evidence. No corroborating witness accounts, no documented patient safety events, no independent incident logs. In 2 of the 4 cases, patient outcome data from the same incident directly contradicted the narrative in the disciplinary report. All 4 were removed. The HR system generated a formal notification on a Thursday morning. Nora was on her way into a shift when it arrived on her phone. She read it standing in the staff entrance corridor with her badge in her hand. Personnel file correction completed. Disciplinary entries dated, 4 dates listed, have been determined to lack substantiation and have been formally expunged from your employment record. Corrected record attached. We apologize for the extended period during which inaccurate documentation remained in your file. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Someone came through the door behind her and excused themselves past. She stepped to the side. The apology at the end was institutional. She knew what it was, knew it had been approved by counsel, and was phrased to be accurate without being an admission of liability. That was fine. She wasn't interested in the phrasing. She was interested in the file, and the file was clean, and that was the thing she had wanted since the first time she'd seen what was in it. She put her phone in her pocket and went to work. The nursing board's formal hearing on Diane Rusk's license was held 29 days after the interim revocation, 3 days ahead of schedule, which meant the evidence package had been assembled faster than projected. Nora was not present at the hearing. It was not a public event, and she had not been called as a witness because the documentary evidence, the deleted complaints, the falsified reports, the staffing manipulation records, the IT forensics, was sufficient without witness testimony. She was on shift when the decision came through. Solano sent a text at 2:14 in the afternoon. Revocation confirmed, permanent, effective immediately. Nora read it at the nursing station, set the phone down, and went back to the chart she'd been updating. A 67-year-old man with a suspected pulmonary embolism who needed her full attention, and he got it. The criminal charges came 3 weeks later. The state attorney general's office filed against Diane Rusk on 4 counts: falsification of official records, obstruction of legally required incident reporting, fraudulent deletion of mandated documentation, and 1 count of criminal interference with a protected complaint process, which was a statute Nora hadn't known existed until Solano explained it. The charges carried cumulative exposure of up to 9 years and significant fines. They filed a single charge against Hendricks as well: conspiracy and the suppression of the complaint from the resident who'd raised concerns about the crash cart. Greer was not charged but was named as a subject of ongoing review, which in the language of these things meant the investigation wasn't finished. The plant incident report, the mass casualty documentation that Grant Puller had filed, went to the State Health Department's Emergency Response Division as part of the standard after-action process. The division's review noted the H2S identification as a significant clinical determination that had meaningfully affected patient outcomes. The note was specific about who had made the call and when. Dr. Vassan stopped Nora in the hallway 3 days after that report went public internally. I read the mass casualty after action, she said, the toxic exposure section. Okay, You identified the H2S exposure mechanism based on symptom presentation before it was confirmed at the scene. Yes. Vassan looked at her for a moment with an expression that was still, as it had been the first time, somewhere between clinical assessment and something more personal. I've been in this department 8 years, she said. I've worked with a lot of nurses. I want to say that directly, so you hear it from me rather than from an after-action report. She paused. You are the best clinical thinker on this floor. That includes the physicians. Nora held her gaze. That's a significant statement. I know. Vassan said it without qualification. I don't make significant statements carelessly. She walked away. Nora stood in the hallway for a second and then walked in the opposite direction because she had a patient in Bay 2 with an arterial line that needed checking, and the statement was going to need time to settle into something she could carry without it feeling strange, and that time was not the middle of a shift. It was Harlan who told her about Joellen Marsh. He'd been following up through the hospital's public communications, the ones released for significant cases after patient consent, and the follow-up came in 6 weeks after the event. Joellen Marsh had been discharged from the neurosurgical unit and had returned to teaching. Partial recovery of function, some residual effects on her right side, significant enough to require ongoing PT but not enough to end her career. She'd gone back to her classroom. She'd also sent a letter to the hospital. Addressed generally to the ER team who had treated her on arrival, it described what she remembered, which was not much because she had been losing consciousness rapidly, and what she'd been told afterward, which was that the speed of the intervention had been the determining factor in her outcome. Her neurologist had told her, apparently with characteristic neurosurgical directness, that 8 fewer minutes in the ER before the OR would likely have meant a different life. The letter was posted on the staff communication board in the break room. Someone had laminated it, which was a thing people did with letters like that, a way of saying, this is permanent, this is what we do this for. Nora read it once, standing up, during a 15-minute break. She did not read it again. One morning in the 6th week after everything had started, she arrived for a shift and found Harlan in the parking lot. This was not unusual by now. He'd extended his stay at the motel on Route 9 far past any original intention, and the Advocacy Coalition had apparently found enough active work in Crestfall to justify maintaining a local presence, or that was the official version. But this morning, he had all 4 of them, Yates, Dix, Bale, and himself, leaning against the truck in the early light. We're heading out today, he said. She'd known it was coming, had known it couldn't be the motel on Route 9 indefinitely. Where? She asked. Fort called her first. After that, he shrugged in a way that meant the after that was variable, which was probably accurate. The coalition has 3 other cases they want to look at, 2 in Oregon, 1 in New Mexico. Military nurses? 1. The other 2 are civilian, but the pattern's the same. Documentation manipulation, institutional retaliation, chain of command protecting itself. He paused. You helped us understand what to look for. The pattern in your case that became a template for identifying it elsewhere. She thought about that. About the record document she'd sat down to write that first morning after the night shift. About the patterns that were more visible written down than they'd been in her head. About Petra Yoon in Arizona, at a community clinic, saying she was glad. Take care of yourselves, she said. Yates said, you too, Callahan. It was one of about 12 words he'd said directly to her across the entire 6 weeks, and it landed with exactly the weight of 12 carefully selected words. Dick said something under his breath that made Bale almost smile. Harlan looked at her for a moment. He didn't extend his hand and she didn't extend hers. It was past that kind of formality. He just looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated regard of someone who had found the person they were looking for and done what they came to do. Renner's mother, he said. Patricia. She wrote back. Nora went still. He reached into his jacket and held out an envelope. She took it. Her name was on the front in handwriting that was careful and slightly arthritic, the handwriting of someone who had taken time over each letter. She asked me to make sure you got it in person, he said. Not by mail. She put it in her pocket. She was not going to open it in a parking lot. He got in the truck. She stepped back. The truck pulled out of the lot and turned onto the street heading east, and she watched it until it was past the first intersection, and then she turned and walked toward the staff entrance. She held the letter until her break. She went to the break room, empty, which was luck, and sat down and opened the envelope. It was 2 pages, handwritten on plain white paper. She read it slowly. Patricia Renner wrote about her son the way mothers wrote about children they'd lost, with a specificity that was both painful and clearly deliberate, like she needed whoever was reading to understand that he had been a particular person, not a category. He'd been funny, she wrote, in a dry way that surprised people. He'd been bad at cooking and good at fixing things. He'd called her every Sunday. She wrote that when the official notification had come, what had stayed with her, what she'd turned over in the months afterward, was the question of whether he'd been alone. She hadn't been able to ask. She hadn't known who to ask. Knowing that you were with him, she wrote, is something I didn't know I needed until I had it. I've been carrying a different version of that night for 3 years. Now I have the right one. I don't know how to thank you for that. I'm not sure thank you is the right thing to say, but I wanted you to know that I received your letter and I read it many times and I'm glad you wrote it. She had signed it, Patricia. At the bottom, in a slightly different pen, like it had been added after the rest. He would have liked knowing someone like you was there. Nora sat in the break room for a few minutes after she finished reading. The refrigerator hummed. Someone had left a half-full coffee pot on the burner, outside the break room door. The department was running its mid-morning pace. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the pocket of her scrubs, close to her chest. She went back to work. The months that followed were not a transformation. That was the wrong word for it. Nora's life did not become unrecognizable. She still worked night shifts, still drove the same car, still fixed the same elastic in her hair when it stretched past usefulness. The work was the work. The assessments, the interventions, the calls that needed making under pressure, the patients who grabbed her wrist in the trauma bay because they were scared and she was the closest human being. But things were different in the ways that mattered. The new director of nursing operations, brought in as part of the administrative restructuring, was a woman named Renata Foss, who had come from a hospital system in the Pacific Northwest and had been specifically selected, the internal communications said, for her background in healthcare workplace culture reform. She was direct and moved fast and was not interested in being liked as much as she was interested in things working correctly. Nora found her, on balance, acceptable, which for Nora was close to a high compliment. Foss met with Nora in her second week on the job. "I've read your file," she said. "The corrected one." "Okay. I've also read the after-action from the mass casualty event and the 2 addenda in the Varick chart and the nursing board's formal finding." She looked at Nora directly. "What do you want?" Nora considered the question. It was more direct than she'd expected, which she appreciated. "I want to keep doing my job," she said, "and I want the environment I'm doing it in to not require me to document myself like I'm building a legal case every time I intervene on a patient outcome." Foss wrote something down. "I'm restructuring the charge position, night shift specifically. There's going to be a new protocol for incident documentation, independent review for any write-up that follows a clinical intervention within 72 hours. The write-up can't be authored by the same person who was present at the intervention." She looked up. "That's not something I invented. I'm told it was a gap identified through your situation." "That's a good protocol," Nora said. "I'd like you to be part of the working group that builds the full implementation guidance. You and Grant Puller and Dr. Vason and 2 nurses from other units." She paused. "You've earned a say in how this place operates. I'm offering you the formal channel for it." Nora thought about saying something about how she'd been doing the work regardless, and wasn't sure she needed the formal channel. She thought about how that answer was accurate, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that having the formal channel mattered, not for her ego, but because the things she'd learned in 3 years of working in a compromised environment were things the working group needed. "Yes," she said. She also started the veterans navigation work, which had been in the back of her mind since the first night Harlan and his team had walked through the main entrance. It began small, a phone call with the Advocacy Coalition, a conversation with a veterans resource coordinator at a community health center on the west side of Crestfall, then a monthly drop-in session, informal, no structure beyond a table and 2 chairs, and Nora being available. Military medics and corpsmen and flight nurses trying to figure out how to translate what they knew into civilian healthcare credentials and civilian workplace dynamics that were bewilderingly different from the chain of command environments they'd come from. She was not a counselor, She did not try to be. She told them what she knew about the specific translation problems, how clinical authority worked differently, how documentation was protective in ways it wasn't in the field, how to read an institutional environment before trusting it. Practical things. The things nobody had told her. The sessions grew. By the fourth month, there were 12 people showing up. Petra Yoon emailed from Arizona. She'd heard about the sessions through the coalition. She asked if she could help design some materials for nurses making the military to civilian transition. Nora said yes. They worked on it by email over 3 weeks and then over a video call that ran 2 hours and covered ground that Nora hadn't been able to articulate to herself before, but found she could articulate to Yoon, who had been in the same rooms, experienced the same mechanisms, and was now operating from the same place of having survived them. The criminal proceedings against Diane Rusk moved at the pace criminal proceedings moved, which was slower than anyone involved would have liked. Nora was not a complaining witness in the case. The state's charges were built on documentary evidence, not victim testimony. But she received updates through Solano, who remained in contact throughout. The preliminary hearing produced no surprises. The evidence was substantial and well-organized, and Rusk's defense counsel did not appear to have a strong theory of contest against the document forensics. The case was heading toward a plea or a verdict, and either outcome would take time. In the interim, Rusk's revoked license was public record. Her name appeared in the State Nursing Board's publicly accessible database under the revoked category, with the date and the notation that criminal charges were pending. Anyone who searched for her would find it. Nora had searched once the first day it appeared. She had not searched again. What she noticed, which she hadn't expected, was that the anger, the specific cold variety she'd been carrying for years, the one that settled and stayed, had changed texture. Not gone. Changed. It was less dense than it had been. Something had moved through it. She wasn't entirely sure what to call that process. She was thinking about it one evening in the break room, which was the kind of ambient thinking you did while you were waiting for coffee to finish, when Dr. Fowler came in. He poured a cup. He stood at the counter. Then he said, without turning around, "I've been trying to figure out if I owe you an apology." "For what specifically?" "For—" He stopped, turned around. "In the Varick resuscitation, I told you to step back." "You did." "You were right, and I was wrong, and a man is alive." He said it in the same tone he used for clinical statements. "I've been doing this for 16 years. I don't like being in the wrong, but I particularly don't like being in the wrong in a way that could have cost someone their life, and being wrong in a way I should have caught faster." He paused. "So yes, I think I owe you an apology." "I think you do too," she said. A pause. He hadn't expected her to agree without softening it. "Okay. You've also put in 2 charted addenda and a statement to the review board, and flagged a patient outcome determination in the mass casualty after action that you didn't have to flag," she said. "I'm aware of those." He looked at her. "An apology and a course correction," she said. "That's what's needed. You've done both." She picked up her coffee. "We're good, Fowler." He looked like he'd expected the conversation to be harder, and wasn't quite sure how to hold the fact that it hadn't been. He nodded once and left the break room. She thought about that afterward, about how forgiveness, or whatever the non-religious version of it was, wasn't the dramatic thing she'd been braced for. It was mostly just accurate accounting. You see what someone did wrong, and you see what they did to correct it, and you make a true assessment of both, and you carry forward. That was all. That was apparently enough. The formal recognition came on a Tuesday, which was the least ceremonial day of the week, which she'd always thought was appropriate. CMO Drexler held a brief departmental meeting at the start of her shift. He did not make speeches. He presented a formal letter of commendation from hospital administration, countersigned by the State Health Department's Emergency Response Division, noting the mass casualty response and the Varick intervention and the corrected file. And he read a paragraph of it aloud, and then he handed it to her, and that was the ceremony. The staff who were present clapped, not a long applause, not a production, just acknowledgement. Vasan was there. Grant Puller was there. Tripp, who was finishing a rotation, was there. A handful of nurses she worked alongside regularly. Nora held the letter and looked at the room and felt something that she could not have put into language if pressed. Something in the range of exhaustion and resolution, and a recognition that the thing she'd been carrying had been real, and that its weight had been real, and that having that confirmed by the world she'd been fighting within was not small. She said, "Thank you." She meant it without complication, which was rarer than it sounded. She put the letter in her locker and started her shift. That night she had a trauma. A 34-year-old cyclist struck by a car, head injury, and significant blood loss. She moved through it cleanly, called the intervention, got him stabilized, and to the OR in time. Afterward, she stood in the trauma bay, in the aftermath quiet that she'd stood in hundreds of times, peeling off her gloves. Someone she hadn't noticed during the resuscitation, a nursing student doing a rotation who'd been in the far corner of the bay, said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" Nora looked at her, 22 maybe, the specific wide-eyed attention of someone seeing the real version of a thing they'd been training for. "Yes," Nora said. "How do you know when to push back? Against a physician or a charge? Or when do you do it and when do you not?" It was a real question. She'd had a version of it herself every day for 3 years, and she still had a version of it, and she thought about how to answer it honestly rather than conveniently. "When the patient needs it," she said. "That's the standard. Not when you're frustrated, not when you're right and someone else is wrong. Those aren't the standard. The standard is whether the patient needs you to act." She paused. "When that's the reason, push back every time. Document everything. Learn the system. Build relationships wherever you can. All of that matters. But when the patient needs it, you act. That part doesn't change." The student nodded slowly. She was turning it over, which was the right response. Nora pulled off the second glove. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay, past the nursing station where the monitors were running and the boards were full and the department was moving in its constant, imperfect, necessary motion. She'd been dismissed as someone who didn't know her place. She'd been written up for knowing it better than anyone else in the room. She'd been reduced to a disciplinary file and a personnel problem and a staffing inconvenience, and the people who'd done that had been so certain of their authority that they'd never considered what would happen if the thing they were suppressing was actually true. The truth had a way of surviving the people who tried to bury it. Not always. Not automatically. Not without cost. But when someone refused to stop being who they actually were, when the thing that made them dangerous to a corrupt system was the same thing that made them indispensable to the people who needed them, eventually the systems ran out of ways to hold that down. Nora Callahan walked back onto the floor. She had patience. She went to work. Patricia Renner wrote about her son the way mothers wrote about children they'd lost, with a specificity that was both painful and clearly deliberate, like she needed whoever was reading to understand that he had been a particular person, not a category. He'd been funny, she wrote, in a dry way that surprised people. He'd been bad at cooking and good at fixing things. He'd called her every Sunday. She wrote that when the official notification had come, what had stayed with her, what she'd turned over in the months afterward, was the question of whether he'd been alone. She hadn't been able to ask. She hadn't known who to ask. "Knowing that you were with him," she wrote, "is something I didn't know I needed until I had it. I've been carrying a different version of that night for 3 years. Now I have the right one. I don't know how to thank you for that. I'm not sure thank you is the right thing to say. But I wanted you to know that I received your letter and I read it many times and I'm glad you wrote it." She had signed it, Patricia. At the bottom, in a slightly different pen, like it had been added after the rest. "He would have liked knowing someone like you was there." Nora sat in the break room for a few minutes after she finished reading. The refrigerator hummed. Someone had left a half-full coffee pot on the burner. Outside the break room door, the department was running its mid-morning pace. She folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the pocket of her scrubs, close to her chest. She went back to work. The months that followed were not a transformation. That was the wrong word for it. Nora's life did not become unrecognizable. She still worked night shifts, still drove the same car, still fixed the same elastic in her hair when it stretched past usefulness. The work was the work. The assessments, the interventions, the calls that needed making under pressure, the patients who grabbed her wrist in the trauma bay because they were scared and she was the closest human being. But things were different in the ways that mattered. The new director of nursing operations, brought in as part of the administrative restructuring, was a woman named Renata Foss, who had come from a hospital system in the Pacific Northwest and had been specifically selected, the internal communications said, for her background in healthcare workplace culture reform. She was direct and moved fast, and was not interested in being liked as much as she was interested in things working correctly. Nora found her, on balance, acceptable, which for Nora was close to a high compliment. Foss met with Nora in her second week on the job. "I've read your file," she said, "the corrected one." "Okay." "I've also read the after-action from the mass casualty event and the two addenda in the Varick chart and the nursing board's formal finding." She looked at Nora directly. "What do you want?" Nora considered the question. It was more direct than she'd expected, which she appreciated. "I want to keep doing my job," she said, "and I want the environment I'm doing it in to not require me to document myself like I'm building a legal case every time I intervene on a patient outcome." Foss wrote something down. "I'm restructuring the charge position, night shift specifically. There's going to be a new protocol for incident documentation. Independent review for any write-up that follows a clinical intervention within 72 hours. The write-up can't be authored by the same person who was present at the intervention." She looked up. "That's not something I invented. I'm told it was a gap identified through your situation." "That's a good protocol," Nora said. "I'd like you to be part of the working group that builds the full implementation guidance. You and Grant Puller and Dr. Vassan and two nurses from other units." She paused. "You've earned a say in how this place operates. I'm offering you the formal channel for it." Nora thought about saying something about how she'd been doing the work regardless, and wasn't sure she needed the formal channel. She thought about how that answer was accurate, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that having the formal channel mattered, not for her ego, but because the things she'd learned in 3 years of working in a compromised environment were things the working group needed. "Yes," she said. She also started the veterans navigation work, which had been in the back of her mind since the first night Harlan and his team had walked through the main entrance. It began small: a phone call with the Advocacy Coalition, a conversation with a Veterans Resource Coordinator at a community health center on the west side of Crestfall, then a monthly drop-in session, informal, no structure beyond a table and 2 chairs, and Nora being available. Military medics and corpsmen and flight nurses trying to figure out how to translate what they knew into civilian healthcare credentials and civilian workplace dynamics that were bewilderingly different from the chain of command environments they'd come from. She was not a counselor. She did not try to be. She told them what she knew about the specific translation problems, how clinical authority worked differently, how documentation was protective in ways it wasn't in the field, how to read an institutional environment before trusting it, practical things, the things nobody had told her. The sessions grew. By the 4th month, there were 12 people showing up. Petra Yoon emailed from Arizona. She'd heard about the sessions through the coalition. She asked if she could help design some materials for nurses, making the military to civilian transition. Nora said yes. They worked on it by email over 3 weeks and then over a video call that ran 2 hours and covered ground that Nora hadn't been able to articulate to herself before, but found she could articulate to Yoon, who had been in the same rooms, experienced the same mechanisms, and was now operating from the same place of having survived them. The criminal proceedings against Diane Rusk moved at the pace criminal proceedings moved, which was slower than anyone involved would have liked. Nora was not a complaining witness in the case. The state's charges were built on documentary evidence, not victim testimony. But she received updates through Solano, who remained in contact throughout. The preliminary hearing produced no surprises. The evidence was substantial and well-organized, and Rusk's defense counsel did not appear to have a strong theory of contest against the document forensics. The case was heading toward a plea or a verdict, and either outcome would take time. In the interim, Rusk's revoked license was public record. Her name appeared in the state nursing board's publicly accessible database under the revoked category, with the date and the notation that criminal charges were pending. Anyone who searched for her would find it. Nora had searched once, the first day it appeared. She had not searched again. What she noticed, which she hadn't expected, was that the anger, the specific cold variety she'd been carrying for years, the one that settled and stayed, had changed texture. Not gone. Changed. It was less dense than it had been. Something had moved through it. She wasn't entirely sure what to call that process. She was thinking about it one evening in the break room, which was the kind of ambient thinking you did while you were waiting for coffee to finish, when Dr. Fowler came in. He poured a cup. He stood at the counter. Then he said, without turning around, "I've been trying to figure out if I owe you an apology." For what specifically? For... He stopped, turned around. In the Varick resuscitation, I told you to step back. You did. You were right, and I was wrong, and a man is alive. He said it in the same tone he used for clinical statements. I've been doing this for 16 years. I don't like being in the wrong, but I particularly don't like being in the wrong in a way that could have cost someone their life, and being wrong in a way I should have caught faster. He paused. So yes, I think I owe you an apology. I think you do too, she said. A pause. He hadn't expected her to agree without softening it. Okay. You've also put in 2 chart addenda and a statement to the review board and flagged a patient outcome determination in the mass casualty after action that you didn't have to flag, she said. I'm aware of those. He looked at her. An apology and a course correction, she said. That's what's needed. You've done both. She picked up her coffee. We're good, Fowler. He looked like he'd expected the conversation to be harder and wasn't quite sure how to hold the fact that it hadn't been. He nodded once and left the break room. She thought about that afterward, about how forgiveness, or whatever the non-religious version of it was, wasn't the dramatic thing she'd been braced for. It was mostly just accurate accounting. You see what someone did wrong, and you see what they did to correct it, and you make a true assessment of both, and you carry forward. That was all. That was apparently enough. The formal recognition came on a Tuesday, which was the least ceremonial day of the week, which she'd always thought was appropriate. CMO Drexler held a brief departmental meeting at the start of her shift. He did not make speeches. He presented a formal letter of commendation from hospital administration, countersigned by the State Health Department's Emergency Response Division, noting the mass casualty response and the Varick intervention and the corrected file. And he read a paragraph of it aloud, and then he handed it to her, and that was the ceremony. The staff who were present clapped. Not a long applause, not a production, just acknowledgement. Vassan was there. Grant Puller was there. Tripp, who was finishing a rotation, was there. A handful of nurses she worked alongside regularly. Nora held the letter and looked at the room and felt something that she could not have put into language if pressed. Something in the range of exhaustion and resolution and a recognition that the thing she'd been carrying had been real and that its weight had been real and that having that confirmed by the world she'd been fighting within was not small. She said, "Thank you." She meant it without complication, which was rarer than it sounded. She put the letter in her locker and started her shift. That night she had a trauma. A 34-year-old cyclist struck by a car, head injury, and significant blood loss. She moved through it cleanly, called the intervention, got him stabilized, and to the OR in time. Afterward, she stood in the trauma bay in the aftermath quiet that she'd stood in hundreds of times, peeling off her gloves. Someone she hadn't noticed during the resuscitation, a nursing student doing a rotation, who'd been in the far corner of the bay, said quietly, "Can I ask you something?" Nora looked at her, 22 maybe. The specific wide-eyed attention of someone seeing the real version of a thing they'd been training for. "Yes," Nora said. "How do you know when to push back? Against a physician or a charge? Or when do you do it and when do you not?" It was a real question. She'd had a version of it herself every day for 3 years, and she still had a version of it, and she thought about how to answer it honestly rather than conveniently. "When the patient needs it," she said. "That's the standard. Not when you're frustrated, not when you're right and someone else is wrong. Those aren't the standard. The standard is whether the patient needs you to act." She paused. "When that's the reason, push back every time. Document everything, learn the system, build relationships wherever you can. All of that matters. But when the patient needs it, you act. That part doesn't change." The student nodded slowly. She was turning it over, which was the right response. Nora pulled off the second glove. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay, past the nursing station where the monitors were running and the boards were full and the department was moving in its constant, imperfect, necessary motion. She'd been dismissed as someone who didn't know her place. She'd been written up for knowing it better than anyone else in the room. She'd been reduced to a disciplinary file and a personnel problem and a staffing inconvenience. And the people who'd done that had been so certain of their authority that they'd never considered what would happen if the thing they were suppressing was actually true. The truth had a way of surviving the people who tried to bury it. Not always. Not automatically. Not without cost. But when someone refused to stop being who they actually were, when the thing that made them dangerous to a corrupt system was the same thing that made them indispensable to the people who needed them, eventually the systems ran out of ways to hold that down. Nora Callahan walked back onto the floor. She had patience. She went to work.